Okay, well, I think we'll begin. My name is Marcia Inhorn. I'm the chair of the Yale Council on Middle East Studies, and I'm very, very pleased to be here with you today because we are having the grand finale of our fall 2021 fall colloquium series in the Yale Council on Middle East Studies with one of my close colleagues and friends, Dr. Kaveh Khoshnood. Before we begin talking about humanitarian crises in the Middle Eastern region, I want to thank all the people who made our colloquium series possible, especially during this ongoing period of COVID, when we have been forced to be converting completely to a Zoom series. And the ones who really helped in that endeavor are our two Yale Council on Middle East Studies postdoctoral fellows, Dr. Vish Sakthaval and Dr. Lizzie Burke, who are here with us today in this colloquium. And I can always I can't say enough good things about the two people who keep our Yale Council on Middle East Studies really going on a day-to-day basis. They are Kristen Siebert, who's our CMES program director, and Marwa Khabour, who is our CMES program associate, who does the beautiful graphic design for all of our colloquia posters. I should say that, this term, because of COVID, we have done this completely by Zoom. There's been no person kind of events taking place in our council. We have high hopes for spring 2022 that we may be able to convert back to an in-person format and ideally with a hybrid dimension so that people outside of Yale can also hear our speakers. But given the uncertainties of the pandemic, and especially with Omicron that's entered our world, we'll have to stay tuned. We really don't know what the spring colloquium series will look like, but we have, again, a wonderful lineup of speakers for next spring, and we hope that you'll join us then. And I think one of the best things that happened because of having to convert to Zoom is that we decided that at least for our fall colloquium series, we would really focus on the work of our Yale faculty. We have a tremendous group of Yale faculty members who work in modern Middle East studies across many different disciplines, from the humanities to medicine and public health. And over the course of this semester, we featured 8 Yale faculty members who talked about things ranging from Algerian and Moroccan poetry to Palestinian citizenship and dance, to Islamic philosophy, to Ottoman history, and more. And so today we are ending in an area that I feel is very important, and we're so lucky that we have Yale faculty in the School of Public Health and School of Medicine who care about humanitarian health and humanitarian crises in the Middle East. And with that, I'm so pleased to be able to introduce to you Dr. Kaveh Khoshnood. Some of you already know him because he's been such a major faculty member for our council, including as the former director of undergraduate studies for our modern Middle East studies major. But here at Yale in general, he's an associate professor and director of undergraduate studies at the Yale School of Public Health, where he's been a faculty member for many years. And he is the co-founder of the Yale Violence and Health Study Group and a faculty member in the program on conflict, resiliency, and health here at the MacMillan Center. Dr. Khoshnood has his training in infectious disease epidemiology. And because of that, he has more than 3 decades of experience, both domestically, including here in New Haven, and internationally, studying the experience and the transmission of HIV and its prevention in vulnerable populations, particularly those who use drugs, and those in foreign settings who are affected by conflict, by war and violence. In general, his interests are in the epidemiology and prevention of HIV/AIDS. He's done a lot of work in public health research ethics, and the topic of today, I would say in the last decade, Dr. Khoshnood has really focused considerably on humanitarian health. To that end, he is the founder and the leader of a new initiative in the Yale School of Medicine called the Humanitarian Research Lab, or HRL, which consists of a group of Yale faculty and students who are dedicated to researching, addressing, intervening in humanitarian health crises around the world. And so that's going to be the topic of our conversation today. We're going to have just a conversation, myself and Dr. Khoshnood, that will then be open to the audience to ask questions. But Dr. Khoshnood is really going to focus on, defining what are humanitarian crises, how do they affect human health, and then we're going to turn to his extensive research in 4 Middle Eastern countries, including Afghanistan, Iran, Lebanon, and Syria. So we'll probably talk for about a half hour together. But at any point during the conversation, you can pose a question by going to the bottom of your Zoom screen and clicking on the Q&A at the right-hand side, and then just typing in a question. And then we can look at them, and Dr. Khoshnood will be able to answer these questions after our conversation. But this will be a conversation, and I'm going to ask my first question to Dr. Khoshnood, which is, what made you interested in the health of populations affected by humanitarian crises? Where did it start for you? And can you give us a little bit of your history in this research area?
Sure. Thank you so much, Marcia, for your kind introduction. Very pleased to be here with all of you. So I was born in Iran, and as I think everybody knows, Iran went through a major political revolution in 1979. I was a teenager then, and I experienced, I would say, political violence, human rights abuses, and also the Iran-Iraq War, which began in 1980 and went on for 8 years, and it ended up killing over 1 million people. Although I was too young to be forced to join the military, but I definitely experienced some of the trauma that our entire country went through. And I ended up leaving the country. I was sort of forced to leave the country to avoid the violence that was happening. And I came to the United States back in 1982. I come from a family of physicians, so I was sort of thinking of becoming a doctor, but then I got interested in public health. And I ended up coming to Yale for my master's degree. This is in late 1980s, and I got really interested in the HIV/AIDS epidemic that you just mentioned, and pretty much focused on that, I would say, for about 2 decades. I was thinking of political violence and conflict sort of the back of my mind, but frankly, I was trying to avoid thinking about that because of the stress that brings to you. But I kept sort of thinking that what do we do as public health professionals when it comes to armed conflict? And when I had an opportunity for a sabbatical in 2013-14, thanks to you, Marcia, who connected me to colleagues at American University of Beirut, Faculty of Health Sciences. I had an opportunity to go there at American University of Beirut, and I really benefited from interacting with colleagues there who were working on kind of refugee health and a lot of humanitarian related research. I had an opportunity to meet with humanitarian organizations, both domestic and international, UN agencies, etc. And I learned a lot from those conversations during my sabbatical year. And when I came back, I decided that I really wanted to focus my attention on health issues and humanitarian crises. I didn't want to completely abandon my HIV/AIDS and substance use related research, but I wanted to bring kind of a humanitarian lens into my work. And that's basically how things got started.
Yeah, that's, and actually then the interest in HIV/AIDS and drug use and so on have really continued as part of your humanitarian focus. We should say that. Can you, for people who are listening, how do you define, or what is meant by the term humanitarian crisis?
Sure, that's a good question. I want to read you a quote from United Nations Disaster Relief Organization. They talk about disasters are too often being regarded as an unusual events, not part of normal life. In reality, however, the opposite is true. Disasters and emergencies are a fundamental part of normal life. They are consequences of the ways societies structure themselves economically and socially, the ways that societies and states interact, and the ways that relationships between the decision makers are sustained. So many of us think of floods, epidemics, earthquakes, droughts, and war as these unusual events. And what they're saying is, the UN agency is saying, is that the opposite is actually true. Rather than being rare events, disasters are actually quite common. There are places in the world that these disasters happen literally on a daily basis. You have seen floods in Sudan. Every other week you hear another set of disasters. And the UN agencies define humanitarian crises or disasters as a serious disruption of the functioning of a society, causing widespread human, material, or environmental losses, which exceed the ability of the affected society to cope using its own resources. So basically, society is unable to function, and that community, whether it's a village, it's a town, or the entire nation, is no longer able to take care of its own needs. It needs external support, international support. When we think of humanitarian crises, there are really two broad categories. One are sort of natural disasters, earthquake, floods, etc. And then there is what they call man-made or human-made disasters. We think of wars, conflict, etc. My particular interest is on armed conflict, sort of the second category. But thinking about climate-related disasters are happening, we can't really ignore that either. So that's something that I'm also beginning to spend some time on. But armed conflict and the consequences on population health is really my area of interest. And then I have a particular interest, as you mentioned, in the Middle East region, but also people who've been displaced due to humanitarian crisis.
Yes, and we'll talk more about that. I guess before we get into some specific issues of particular places in the region, you've been doing this kind of work now for at least a decade. What are some of the challenges of actually working to produce health-related research with populations in situations of humanitarian crisis, and particularly, I would say, armed conflict, because that's your special area of focus. So what are some of the issues you and colleagues confront trying to do work, especially in a place like Afghanistan or elsewhere?
Right. There are many, many challenges. I would put them in two buckets. I would say logistical and ethical challenges. On the logistical, I'm talking about, for example, just accessing the populations that have been displaced, whether they're in informal tent settlements like in Lebanon, or they're in some kind of a refugee camp. Accessing those populations is not a trivial thing. It's kind of require all sorts of partnerships, etc. There's also travel restrictions. If you want to travel to certain parts of the world that are gone through humanitarian crisis, you may not be allowed to do that by the US government, by your own academic institution, etc. I mean, I'm collaborating with some colleague in Somalia. We are able to do things remotely, but traveling there is not an option. So there's logistical challenges. There are also sanctions. One of the things that I'm happy to talk to you about is a project that I'm a co-investigator on, looking at cancer treatment in northwest Syria, at a part of Syria that's not under government control. And we wanted to hire medical students, Syrian medical students on the ground, to be able to work with us on doing this cancer prevention research. And there's a lot of sanctions. And even though, again, this one region of Syria is not under government control, but months and months of conversations with lawyers at Yale to figure out how to do that. And basically we were told, nope, you cannot be hiring medical students on the ground, which from a logistical and ethical perspective, frankly, we thought it was very appropriate to do that. They said, no, you can only hire Yale students. So there's all kinds of logistical challenges to do this work. I would say also funding is a bit of an issue. There's not a lot of, to my knowledge, sort of specific funding opportunities for doing humanitarian research, although there are organizations that do fund these projects. On the ethical side, when I say some of the ethical challenges, I don't mean just sort of the IRB process, the ethics committee review, which, by the way, is obviously necessary, needs to be done, and it's not a trivial thing itself. Imagine you are trying to respond quickly to health needs of populations affected by conflict, and then the IRB process could take 6 months or a year or longer sometime. How do you navigate that? Sort of this urgent research that's needed, and the IRB says it's going to take months and months. Second thing is sometimes IRBs, frankly, becomes kind of a political process. They're concerned of approving a research project that involves refugees in their community, because they're worried about how that may reflect on the institution. So sometimes they're not really, and I can talk about my own experience of trying to get local ethical approval for a substance use related research project in Lebanon. And it honestly took over a year and a half to get approved. And I had to remove certain strategies, research strategies, because the IRB was really not comfortable approving that. But when you think about the ethics of some of the ethical challenges of doing research in humanitarian setting, one of the key topics in ethics is autonomy, respecting the autonomy of the individuals, making sure it's an informed voluntary participation. If you are a refugee stuck in a refugee camp, desperate to get out, when somebody shows up to sort of ask questions about whatever health concerns they may have, they may see this as an opportunity for you to help them get out of the condition they're in. And even if you remind them, I'm sorry, but I'm not a humanitarian organization, I'm a researcher. I'm trying to understand, for example, what are some of the mental health issues you may be going through, et cetera. But they may see that as they have to say yes, because otherwise it may somehow negatively impact their ability to get out of where they're at. So they're very vulnerable. They have kind of reduced sort of autonomy. So it's not a trivial thing to get consent. And also, there are potential harms. I mentioned mental health. If you're asking questions about kind of the trauma they've gone through before they got to the refugee camp, it may trigger them to go back to those settings. And especially if you're not a clinician or there are not available resources to them, I mean, you don't want to add burden to the burdens that they already have. So there's a whole range of ethical issues in conducting research in humanitarian setting, which I feel like we need to be fully prepared for before we get started with those kinds of projects.
Yeah, incredibly important and many different factors. Even working in countries that don't have IRB institutions set up can be a challenge. Yeah. Well, what would you consider to be the sort of key pillars of effective health research on humanitarian issues, especially in settings, undergoing armed conflict? Are there some sort of goals that health researchers like you, aim for in doing ethical, effective research?
Right. Well, I would say the first thing that comes to mind is a long-term partnership. You need to have well-established partnership with communities on the ground. In particular, I would say you need an academic institution on the ground to collaborate with you. When I'm working in Lebanon, I'm collaborating with colleagues at the American University of Beirut who are on the ground. They have academic knowledge, they have cultural knowledge and expertise, linguistic, etc. The other thing is partnership with humanitarian organizations. It can't be just about research. The research needs to, yes, produce scholarly work, evidence that could help with humanitarian organizations and long-term, but it also needs to ideally offer some benefits on the ground. And partnering with humanitarian organization is, I would say, another key component. In terms of priorities, like what are the, you may have your own research interests, but do they align well with what's needed on the ground? This is something that I frankly struggle with all the time. I have expertise in HIV prevention research, substance use, etc. Well, is that the need on the ground? And I've had conversation with colleagues in Lebanon, and sometimes they said, that's not our priority. That's not what we want to work on. We have other needs, we have other priorities. And you have to sort of respect that, and you have to figure out, all right, you mentioned mental health, you mentioned injury prevention. That's not my expertise, but I would be happy to reach out to my colleagues who have that expertise and bring them in. And frankly, that's sort of what's been going on with some of my work. I mean, one of the things that came up for me in Lebanon when I went to some of the nonprofit organization, Cancer came up, that there was complete lack of access to treatment, prevention, etc., among displaced Syrians in Lebanon. And I said, well, I'm not a cancer specialist, but let me reach out to my colleagues who are renowned oncologists, and let me see what I can, if I can put a team together. And that's exactly what I did.
That's really interesting. We never think of chronic diseases, or, life-threatening diseases like cancer as being part of the humanitarian profile. It's other things, food security and infectious disease and reproductive health issues. But, this shows that there are all sorts of issues that have to be addressed. I would like to, since this is a Council on Middle East Studies presentation, and you've worked in really a variety of different countries in the region, I'd kind of like to go country by country and have you sort of talk about, the research that you have done, and also maybe discuss some of the most pressing needs that you see in terms of humanitarian health right now. And to begin with Afghanistan, because of course it has been a crisis, especially we all watched, the unfolding chaos with the American troop withdrawal. And we know that there are real issues of health and food security and so on in the country. But you've done a lot of work, including on substance use in Afghanistan. So sort of take us there and talk through, your research and what you see as the special issues facing Afghanistan.
Sure. So I've done limited work, I would say, in Afghanistan, and it goes back about a decade. And I had an opportunity to travel there once. Again, it was over a decade ago. And substance abuse is definitely a big topic in Afghanistan. I think many of you may know that when we think of Afghanistan and substance use, often we think about the production, that Afghanistan is one of the largest producers of opium and also cannabis. But it's not just that they're producing opium products. There's also opiate use among the Afghan population. And one of the things that we researched was what's the relationship between conflict, displacement, and opiate use? And what we sort of learned is that, during the multiple conflicts that Afghanistan has gone through, millions of the Afghan populations have been displaced. And most of them went to two countries, the neighboring countries of Pakistan and Iran. And then many of them returned after the initial fall of the Taliban over a decade ago. And it turned out that these two countries, Pakistan and Afghanistan, some of the Afghan refugees actually ended up getting involved in substance use, in particular heroin use. And also these countries both have higher rates of HIV infection. So when the Afghan populations came back, they brought substance use back with them. So one of the studies we did showed that about 40% of Afghans using drugs actually got started with these substances in Iran and Pakistan. This is a topic that we actually did a systematic review paper looking at what's the level of understanding and evidence on how conflict can lead to a rise in opiate use. And we found very, very limited papers on that. We ended up publishing this systematic review, and one of the main findings was that there's lack of data, actually. There isn't a lot of longitudinal data where you can see how opiate use sort of has gone up pre and post-conflict. So you kind of had to scrap the data from all kinds of UN agencies, etc. So that was the study we did, sort of trying to understand substance use and risk for HIV infection. Both Afghanistan and I would say Iran, opiate use has been going on for centuries, frankly. But a lot of that historically has been smokable form. So people would be smoking opium, but there has been a rise in injection of heroin, both in Iran and Afghanistan. And injection has its own risk factors, particularly if the syringes are being shared. Now you're going to, in addition to the opiate use itself and its negative effects on the body, now you're also going to get exposed to bloodborne infections like HIV and hepatitis C. So that was some of the work we did, again, over a decade ago. Currently, the only project I'm working with one of our MPH students is to look at the impact of COVID on mental health of Afghan children who are actually resettled right here in New Haven. So that's a sort of Afghanistan-related project, but among Afghans who've been resettled in New Haven.
That's really interesting. And I'm going to hold that thought about COVID for maybe a bit later. But, so you introduced yourself as basically being displaced, forcibly displaced from Iran. And, Iran has taken in, I think the figures are as many as 3 million Afghans, who've fled the country. And so can you talk a little bit about Iran and, work that you've done about Iran, and have you worked actually on refugee issues in, one of the major refugee receiving countries in the region?
Right. So because of the fact that you mentioned, I was forced to leave Iran, and I sort of went through the border with Pakistan. Returning to Iran was problematic for me politically, so I didn't do that, except there was a bit of an opening many years ago during the Khatami presidency. And I was told that this is an opportunity for you to go back if you want to. So I did go back. And when I did go back, I ended up connecting with some colleagues who've been working on HIV/AIDS and substance use. And I was really impressed by what they were doing under very difficult political circumstances. They were doing needle exchange programs, including in prison system, which I was just very surprised. It's something that's very controversial, not even done in the United States. So I kind of connected with some colleagues in Iran and began to do some substance use HIV-related research. But when Ahmadinejad took over as the next president, all those projects, frankly, stopped because politically they did not want those kinds of studies to be done. But I've continued to do some remote-based research with colleagues in Iran. Again, most of the work has been on substance use and HIV. But you mentioned humanitarian crisis. Iran and Iraq went through a horrible war, which included chemical weapons being used by the Iraqi government against Iranian civilians. And I had a student, Iranian-American student, who was really passionate about some of the long-term mental health consequences of being exposed to chemical weapons. And I ended up working with Farnoosh, and she went back to Iran and did a study which looked at long-term mental health effects of exposure to chemical weapons. Fascinating study. She had just a few $1,000 fellowship fund from Yale, led this project, ended up completing it, got it published in JAMA back in 2006, I believe. And it was one of the few papers, to my knowledge, that looked at long-term consequences of exposure to chemical weapons, which unfortunately are also happening in Syria. And it showed that 17 years after exposure to chemical weapons, there are civilians in Iran who are still struggling with anxiety, with PTSD, depression, due to their exposure to chemical weapons. So that was a project we did. I've done one study, collaborated on a study looking at tuberculosis among Afghans in Iran. But that's really been all that I've been able to do. It's not easy to do projects in Iran because, again, it's highly politicized and the government is very cautious about studies that involve refugees, etc. Currently, I am working remotely with some colleagues at the Shiraz University of Medical Sciences, looking at the impact of COVID on an increase in interpersonal violence against women. And I'm actually frankly surprised that they wanted to proceed with that project, because I was concerned about their safety if the government is not too happy to see that kind of a study being done. But we are collaborating right now.
Yeah, Iran is a fascinating country in many different ways. It has a highly developed medical infrastructure that, in the West, people don't really know about. I was lucky to go in 2006 when Ahmadinejad was still in power, the only time I've been there. And I have to say, I just want to interject that, my own work, I have looked, because I work with Iraqi refugees in the US. The US has dumped many chemical weapons on, in its warfare in the region. We can't forget that. I mean, especially in Iraq, in the two wars, there was massive use of the radioactive toxin, depleted uranium. So the long-term effects of chemical warfare in the region are, something we really need to be thinking about and studying. So I'm glad that you, have looked at that, at least in Iran. I mean, very interesting research. Well, the country that we both have spent considerable time in and care a great deal about is Lebanon. And Lebanon, as viewers may know, is going through a very, very difficult time right now, especially economically, politically, infrastructurally. But while doing so, while being in its own state of, we could say, humanitarian crisis, there's also a huge Syrian refugee population living in Lebanon. So I'd like you to focus for a bit on Lebanon, your work there, and what you see as the really pressing concerns in that small country.
Right. When I sort of think of projects that I want to do in humanitarian settings, there's two things that come to mind. One is, what expertise do I have? What are the topics that I can contribute to? But second, I want to know about what are the topics, humanitarian health topics, that are neglected, that are understudied, and they need attention. So I'm always sort of asking that question. So as we already talked about, substance use, HIV/AIDS has been a long-term interest and expertise on myself. So I brought that topic, and I had conversation with colleagues in Lebanon about to what extent this is a priority for them. Is this something they want research on, etc. And the answer by some was yes, by others, like, no, that's not a priority for us. We have other needs. So I definitely got interested to collaborate with colleagues on the ground in Lebanon on HIV and substance use related research. We've done a couple of projects already, and now we are thinking about some sort of an intervention study with a particular focus on men who have sex with men, both Lebanese but also Syrian population. But a whole range of other topics came up. I briefly mentioned cancer. There was an conversation I had with a colleague who's a Syrian cancer specialist doctor who was displaced himself from Syria to Lebanon. And given his own interest and background, he was very concerned that many of the Syrian women who have been displaced in Lebanon for over a decade now have cancer issues that are completely neglected. And actually, their nonprofit organization managed to secure some funding, some limited funding, to be able to do some mammography and just do some cancer screening for breast cancer. And he mentioned this one story to me, which really stayed with me. He mentioned this one woman who was diagnosed with early cancer, early stage breast cancer. And when she approached the UN agency that have some limited funds to provide for urgent care to get access to treatment for her breast cancer, she was told that, oh, you're in early stage. The funding we have is limited to people who are in sort of end stage, like let's say stage 4 breast cancer. So unfortunately, we can't basically offer you any treatment. Basically, they were saying, come back when breast cancer gets worse for you, and then we are allowed to spend our fund. That is the most anti-public health strategy, and of course, incredibly immoral, unethical way to deal with a problem like that. But this is sort of the reality on the ground. They have extremely limited funds, and they're allocating. They have a committee that looks at your diagnoses and then offers you some funds for your treatment. So this woman, unfortunately, 9 months later, had much more advanced stages of breast cancer, and then she was able to, I think, access some treatment. So when I heard that story, it stuck with me, and I wanted to do something about this. But as I mentioned, cancer treatment or prevention even is not really my expertise, but I connected with colleagues at Yale and elsewhere. And then I had a public health undergraduate student, Jude Alawa, a Syrian American student who was very interested in Syrian health. And we had a conversation. I brought up cancer treatment to him, and he ended up leading a project, I think the first of its kind in Lebanon, to interview hundreds of both Syrian and Lebanese population and ask them about what their understanding and knowledge is about cancer, risk factors for it, whether they have any access to screening, to treatment, etc. And it was a really, I would say, meaningful project. The study was published, and now our colleagues in Lebanon are actually sort of acting on some of that data. So that's become another area of interest to me, not just in Lebanon, but also, I would say, other humanitarian settings, including inside Syria itself, which I'm happy to talk to you about.
Yeah, let's talk about Syria. And, the fact, I believe the statistic is that 1.4 million Syrians live in Lebanon, which is a country with only about 4 million people. Every 4 people in Lebanon now are actually Syrian, they're refugees. And, talk about the relationship and what's going on in Syria and, the prospects, I suppose, for those displaced in Lebanon of ever getting back to Syria. And so, what are issues, health issues, projects, things that you're thinking about and working on in terms of Syrians and their own crisis?
So most of my project on the Syrian population has been in Lebanon or Jordan. HIV, cancer, mental health issues, but also relationship between mental health and non-communicable diseases, which is somewhat of, I would say, another neglected area when we think about diabetes or hypertension and mental health. We see them as 2 separate things, but if somebody is struggling to get out of bed because of all the mental health issues they've gone through, their ability to adhere to their treatment for their diabetes or hypertension is extremely limited. So mental health and NCD care really need to be much more integrated. So most of the projects have been in Lebanon and Jordan, but I've actually started to do a project in Syria itself. As I mentioned, Northwest Syria, about 4 million people live without any government support, and mostly humanitarian organizations are operating there, including SAMS, Syrian American Medical Society. So at the moment, we have one project that's led by my colleague, Dr. Anis Chakbar, who's a breast cancer specialist at Yale. And this is to SAMS, the Syrian American Medical Society, establish, to my knowledge, the only cancer treatment in a conflict zone in Northwest Syria. And we are supporting them to analyze the data they've been collecting on breast cancer patients for the last few years, and also to interview some of the stakeholders to understand how well they are operating and what they can do to improve it. The other project that I'm working on is about mortality surveillance. So in Northwest Syria, again, because of the absence of government, there is no mortality surveillance. So if somebody asks the question, in this region, how many people died and of what causes, let's say in 2020, unfortunately, there's no answer. We don't know how many people died, and we don't know what causes. So establishing a mortality surveillance system is an urgent public health matter. So we are collaborating with some Syrian colleagues who are actually operating out of Turkey and neighboring Syria. And they are collecting mortality data from some of the health facilities that are operating there. But they recognize that many of the people who pass away in Northwest Syria don't actually die in a health facility. They die in their own home and they're buried. And that information, it's kind of invisible. That record is invisible. So one of the things we are working on is what's known as verbal autopsy. Verbal autopsy is basically training community health workers to go and knock on doors and actually ask the question of, has someone passed away in your household over the last 6 months or a year? And could you tell us what some of the symptoms were, et cetera, just to try to capture sort of number of people who died and of the causes. So bringing verbal autopsy and clinical, sort of clinic-based data is hopefully will validate these sort of mortality data, which again, it's crucial. If we don't know how many people are dying and of what causes, it's impossible to come up with effective interventions. We don't know how many people in Northwest Syria are dying of injuries or of cancer, of suicide, etc. So this is a crucial project. We actually applied for a grant from the CDC, and we got a pretty good score, but it was not funded. And now we are approaching different funders to go ahead with that project.
Yeah, it's really important. I mean, the issue of the body count of people of death during conflict or during, when people are displaced is a huge problem in terms of counting, right? Surveillance and counting. And so it's a crucial matter, but it's very problematic for the reasons you've pointed out. So I think, again, another pressing humanitarian concern, just to sort of know and document the mortality and morbidity for things like cancer, these that are sometimes invisible. I want to encourage people who have a question for Dr. Khoshnood to type it into the Q&A if you want to, so that he can answer them. Meanwhile, I'd actually like to talk about the current pandemic, and I know you don't work on COVID per se, that's not your area, but you are an infectious disease epidemiologist, and we're hearing a lot of very worrisome information about the new variant. But can you talk at all about the COVID situation in the countries that you've worked with and on, but just in the region, and how public health authorities are grappling with COVID in this part of the Middle East?
Yeah, I mean, I obviously, as you said, as an infectious disease epidemiologist, I kind of couldn't ignore COVID pandemic. And I was approached by a couple of colleagues, Lebanon, Iran, Somalia, actually. And I of course said, yes, how can I support you? In Iran, as I mentioned, my colleague is looking at how this pandemic has sort of worsened interpersonal violence against women. And that's a project that we were helping them analyze their data and publish their study. In Somalia, Dr. Deko Mohammed, who was a world fellow at Yale many years ago, she reached out to us and said, we really need support to collect some data on how COVID-19 is taking a toll on internally displaced people in Somalia. And I was able to put together a team of students, mostly from Yale, but also from outside of Yale, to collaborate with Dr. Deko remotely. And we ended up helping her and her staff in Somalia to collect data on what's going on with internally displaced population, how many are they, what are their pre-existing conditions they have, what's their level of access to clean water, sanitation, etc. And also we helped her collect data on healthcare workers. What was their level of knowledge about COVID? What was their access to protective measures for themselves, etc. And those two projects went ahead over the last year successfully, again, all done remotely with no funding whatsoever. And again, they were, I think, quite impactful. Our colleague in Somalia was able to use that data to make a strong pitch to both the government, but also to humanitarian organization operating in Somalia of what the needs are. So we were able to do some of that work remotely, which actually is making me sort of make this pitch to colleagues at Yale that in many humanitarian settings, even after hopefully COVID is done, still working in country is sometimes impossible due to travel restrictions, et cetera, that I mentioned. But we learned through this pandemic that you can really have impactful work done remotely. So why not kind of promote that remote-based research in humanitarian setting? We are not going to be able to send students to Yemen. to do projects, but we can do work remotely with them, with colleagues on the ground. So why not do that? And that is something that I've been thinking about a lot. And again, I've had good experience working with colleagues in Iran, now in Syria, in Lebanon, and Somalia. So I feel like it's doable. It's something we can do.
Yeah, as an anthropologist, as a medical anthropologist, I can say it is possible to do research by Zoom, and if you can connect to people and get support for it. So I think this pandemic has really changed our outlook on, what is meaningful and effective research. I mean, throughout your presentation, Kaveh, you've talked about all of these incredible Yale students who've really participated in your projects in various ways. And now you have the Humanitarian Research Lab to sort of bring together students, faculty who are interested in humanitarian crises and health. And can you just talk a little bit more about that? Just, who joins, are you welcoming, Yale people into these projects? Talk a little bit about this HRL, this Humanitarian Research Lab, and what Yale, how Yale can help, I guess.
Yes. No, thanks for asking that. So as I've been talking is that the range of health issues in humanitarian setting, and by the way, not just health, but there are other sort of urgent needs in humanitarian setting. It's so vast. So, a single faculty member are not able to do what's needed. And we have unbelievable set of expertise and resources at Yale. Colleagues who do mathematical modeling, who do mental health research, who do cancer work, who, the whole range of expertise. So what I like to do is bring all of these folks together and to be able to address the urgent needs in humanitarian setting. And, I've somewhat succeeded to do that, but as you mentioned, this Humanitarian Research Lab website was just launched a few days ago, actually. And the point of it is, I want it to be primarily a resource for students who often reach out to me, some of the applicants who are coming to Yale or planning to come, or students who are already here, who have a passion for working in humanitarian settings, but are looking for resources at Yale. And they told me that it took them 6 months or longer to find out that there's a course at the Jackson Institute or at the School of Management or our own School of Public Health, which helps them prepare for humanitarian setting. So creating this Humanitarian Research Lab website is an attempt to kind of bring all the resources available together, courses, funding opportunities from Macmillan and other sources, etc. I'm working closely with my colleague Nathaniel Raymond, who's a lecturer at the Jackson Institute, and also has a secondary appointment with our School of Public Health with a long-term interest and experience work in humanitarian setting. Students have done remarkable work, frankly, Marsha, and most of them, perhaps not surprisingly, come from families of either sometimes refugees or immigrants themselves. They are Syrian American, they're Lebanese American, Iranian American, etc. So they kind of have a personal experience. Not all of them, but many of them have that. And they really are asking the question of what can I do? How can I support work in humanitarian setting? And the good news is, as I mentioned, there's quite a bit of work that we can do, especially remotely. It doesn't require them to travel to areas where there's also personal safety issues, etc. So yeah, it's been a pleasure working with the students. And my long-term vision and goal is to establish some kind of a robust academic program to prepare those students who have a passion for getting jobs, employment in humanitarian organization, whether it's UN agencies, whether it's Doctors Without Borders, International Rescue Committee, USAID, etc. There are a particular set of skills that they need to be able to get those positions, and I feel like we need to prepare them to get there.
Yeah, is there anything else, that people besides research could be doing who might be listening, to sort of help address these kinds of crises? You've talked about such a range of issues, but final thoughts?
I would say yes, absolutely. One thing that comes to my mind as being an academic institution is educational needs. There are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. I'm thinking of students whose education was disrupted. And I'm particularly interested in students who were studying to be a physician, to become a nurse, and country collapsed, a crisis happened, and their school was disrupted or sometimes bombed, like in Syria. Um, what can we do to support those students to keep advancing with their academic career, especially those who want to go into the health profession? And to my knowledge, I haven't seen like a consortium of universities in US or Europe to come together and figure out the answer to that question. A couple of years ago, we had a discussion at the MacMillan Center on this very topic, and we actually connected through WhatsApp with about 100 Syrian medical students and their faculty members who were literally hiding in this sort of basement because they could not display where they were because the government actually bombs schools. And we had conversation with how we can support them in terms of providing online education for those students. And actually, we did advance a bit, but there's a lot more work to be done. So I would say the educational needs of students whose education has been disrupted by violence, conflict in their country is an urgent topic as well.
Yeah. And we're also trying to address scholars at risk from the region now, which you've been deeply involved in. Maybe you want to just say a final word about
Sure.
that.
So there are a number of universities, Harvard comes to mind, who established a robust scholars at risk program. And what these programs do, they offer kind of a temporary appointment for scholars who are stuck in their country that's going through violence. They are frankly worried about their own personal safety, and they're unable to proceed with their scholarship. And I think with the sort of the crisis in Afghanistan, this developing some kind of a robust scholars at risk program at Yale is even far more urgent now. A colleague at the Yale Law School, Jim Silk, has a Center for Human Rights, and he has been working on this. But I think we need to expand the program, make it a well-established program at Yale, and offer these opportunities for scholars who really are in, terrible risk of arrest, persecution of all kinds, and also unable to move forward with their scholarship.
Well, we've had many wonderful comments, compliments in the chat. No Q&A questions because I think you've covered everything in great detail, and we're sort of at the end of our time, Dr. Khoshnood, but it's been a wonderful conversation. And all I can say is that, hats off to you for doing really urgent, important, meaningful research on topics that, not that many people are undertaking in conflict ridden parts of the region. It's really important, it's impactful. And, so congratulations for everything that you've done. And I hope you'll continue doing this kind of work, even despite the pandemic, and we'll come back to talk about the next, parts of it in the future. And so we're getting one just comment from Teresa Delgado. Is it something about, let's see, in the Q&A, just to say, oh, there's a program. Can Yale create a question? Can Yale create a program that increases research capacity in humanitarian settings? Maybe take that one question before we depart.
That's a great question. Actually, absolutely yes. I mean, the idea, it makes perfect sense for us as an academic institution in a high-income country to partner with academic institutions in low middle-income countries, especially those that are in a humanitarian setting and are going through conflict. That makes a lot of sense. My colleague, Dr. Hani Mowafi, who is an emergency medicine doctor, just recently got a grant from NIH to strengthen research capacity at American University of Beirut on injury prevention research. So that is a terrific example of what's possible to do to train master's level and even PhD level colleagues in Lebanon to do their own research on injury prevention research. So that is, I'm glad somebody asked that question. That really makes a lot of sense.
And so there are many compliments that you can read in the Q&A, Kaveh, but I think we'll wrap it up. It's 1 o'clock. And again, just thank you for being, the end, final speaker in a colloquium series with such an important topic and really meaningful and great work. And so thank you everyone who attended today, and we'll say goodbye for now, but hope that some of you will join us again in the spring 2022 colloquium series, which we hope may have an in-person component. So we'll say bye and thank you so much.
Thank you, Marcia.
Thank you.